Hello and good evening to everybody. The numbers are creeping up fast. We've got a record number of people wanting to join our webinar tonight. You'll have seen this was actually written as being presentation by Brian Corbett, and I'm delighted to say that he's brought two colleagues with him, Maddie Phillips and Richard Titchener. All three of them are members of the Maritime Heritage Trust, and Maddie and Brian are both trustees. The talk will be in three parts, and we will start with Maddie. She works for the Heritage Marine Foundation in Malden, and she has a degree in maritime archaeology, which is what first led her to go on to Thames Sailing Barges, and she got the bug. And she's going to talk to us about Thames barges, a brief history and their development, design, and all sorts of things connected with the Thames Sailing Barges. She will then hand over to Richard, who is going to talk about cargo under sail. Richard is a barge skipper and has been for many years. He is executive officer of Sea Change Sailing Trust, and will mention that again at the beginning of his talk. He tells me he's been sailing longer than he can actually remember. But the Sea Change is part of the Sail Training Association and linked with sailability and getting young people onto the water. And finally, Brian will be talking to us about the more modern sail that is being developed, and he's already put in the chat a link to a video that he will be talking about later. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Maddie to start us off, and then we'll work through from there. And if I can ask everybody from all the other panelists to disappear while Maddie, and I suggest that that you may want to put a speaker view on your screen so that you get Maddie.
Great, can everyone see that? And can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm Maddie.
Okay, perfect. Well, I hope my internet holds out. Thank you very much for coming. I'm going to be talking about Thames barges and their history and their development and the work that they did, and why I think that's really important, particularly for a webinar with trade on sail as the topic, because I think they make a really, really interesting case study and a really valuable thing to learn from. So I think there might be some of you in the audience that already know quite a lot about Thames barges, in which case I hope you'll bear with me for the next quarter of an hour. And for the people that don't, let's start out with what a Thames barge actually is. So here's a diagram of one. So a barge is kind of fairly generally defined as a flat-bottomed vessel for carrying cargo, which is precisely what they are. But there are many different types, but I don't have time to talk about all of them, so I'm just talking about Thames barges. And there are some things that make them quite specific. So as I've mentioned, they're flat-bottomed and quite boxy to accommodate, so they can carry cargo. Thames barges were generally about 80 to 90 feet long. There were some bigger and some smaller, but broadly speaking, that's how big they were. And they kind of look like this in section. So you can, they look a bit like a loaf tin, which is kind of fun. And they also don't have keels because they were very shallow draft as well, because the area they worked was very shallow water and very tidal. So it was better to have a flat bottom and not much under the waterline, which was impressive for their length. So to stop them going sideways, they also have leadboards, which are adopted from Dutch designs, and they act in place of a keel, and they can be raised and lowered depending on what tack you're on and how much water you're in, which is useful. And probably one of the most recognizable things about the Thames barges is the fact that they are spritsail rigged, which is unusual. There aren't many boats that use them, which is interesting. But the reasons why the Thames barge adopted them makes a lot of sense, because the way the sail is stored when it's not in use is it's stored up the mast. You don't raise and lower it to the deck every time. And when you want to use it, you let the brails go and it comes out a little bit like a theatre curtain. And when it's not in use, it's stored like this. And the reason why this was really, really good is because it made the sail very easy to handle by very few people. So despite the fact that I've mentioned these things were nearly 100 foot long and they could carry, 160 to 180 tons of cargo, they were sailed by 2 members of crew. Some of the big ones had 3, but for the most part, they just had 2 crew members, which is really, really impressive, and an excellent way of keeping your costs down if you want to make a profit. Yeah, in my opinion, that makes them a really, probably one of the most efficient and neatly designed boat for the work that they did and the area that they sailed in that I've ever come across. And I think that's really impressive. So where did they come from? Most of the features I've just mentioned came from much older designs of boats, different barges and working vessels. So as I've said, the leadboards were Dutch in origin. These are some pictures of older barges. I'm sorry about the quality, but as you can, some of them had square sails. The spritsail rig was in use earlier on. As you can, in the bottom left corner, they could actually raise and lower their gear to shoot bridges or sail under bridges, which was also useful. But as you can see, their hulls were quite a different shape, and they look a bit more like what we would understand as lighters, really. And the Thames barge hull shape didn't come around until much later. So yeah, where did the Thames barge, as I've just described it, come from? Like, where did that stem from? And I really can't talk about that without mentioning a man called Henry Dodd, who I could not find a picture of, unfortunately. So I'm making do with this poster from the 150th event of the Thames Sailing Barge match, which he founded. Incidentally, it's the 2nd longest running sailing event in the world after the America's Cup, but the Thames match still uses the same kind of boats that were sailed 150 years ago, which I think is amazing. Henry Dodd made a fortune in sorting and moving rubbish. He was nicknamed the Golden Dustman, and he was the inspiration for the character in the Charles Dickens novel. And in the second half of the 19th century, he wanted to see sailing barges and sailing cargo vessels still be able to compete with the newer technologies which were already established and rapidly expanding, like rail cargo and like steamships were at the time. So he started the barge match to encourage the development of the class. So the design of the boat that I've just described as being very efficient and very effective for the work they did came out of the pressure to compete not only against each other, but against mechanized cargo transport as well. And the reason why they kind of developed so effectively was because the prize, I think in the early days for the barge match, it was work. So if you built good barges and you won the races, then you won the cargoes, and that earned you money as well as prestige. Yeah, so it was in large part due to that influence that we saw a class of vessel that was very successful and able to compete with and also exist alongside, I guess, kind of perceived as more modern methods of carrying cargo. And the reason why I say they could exist at the same time is because this looks quite prosaic, but is an example of that. So this is the hull of the barge Thistle, it was built in 1895, and this part that's highlighted here is an original feature, and it's called a keel rubber, and it was added to support an engine if she had one added. She was built without an engine, but the people who built her thought that she might at some point in her life have one added if it would suit her, if she needed it. So they decided to think ahead and added one of these, which I think is really impressive. And you can see from the massive propeller that she did eventually have one added. But I think it's a really interesting example of how the sailing aspect and the engine aspect of cargo transport, they did exist alongside one another. Actually, I heard an anecdote from someone who used to work on the barges when they were trading, that some people were really happy when their barges had engines added, because it meant they could work when there was no wind, so they could still earn money, which was great. So they would use the engine to make the passage, and then as soon as it came to tying up alongside, they'd switch it off and do it under sail, because they couldn't work out how to do it with an engine. And they just thought doing it under sail, it was obvious. It was really easy, like, of course you just do it this way. And doing it with an engine seemed really foreign and alien, and why on earth would you do it that way? Which is the exact opposite of how most people approach sailing with engines today. And I think that's really interesting. So what was this work they were competing for? I'm gonna get the next screen. There we go. Yeah. So I would like to now talk about two kind of cycles of materials that were really, really important to London in the late 19th and the early 20th century. There were lots and lots of different cargoes carried as well, but I'm going to talk about these ones. One from Essex and one from Kent. So I'm going to start with the Essex one, mostly because I just wanted to show you this picture. This is a barge carrying a stack of hay to London. I just think it's really impressive they could sail that way. So here's the cycle. So hay was taken from Essex to London to feed the horses, that was still very much used for most transport in the city at the time. And the manure that was cleared off the streets of London was put onto barges and carried to Essex and used as fertilizer on the field to grow the crops, which then produced hay, which was taken to London to feed the horses. And I think that's really neat. And yeah, I think it's also a really interesting example of kind of a sustainable cargo and how important the work that the barges did was towards to London at the time, even though it's probably not the nicest work. And the second one is the barges involved in brick making. So these guys are shoveling mud into the barge, which must just be such a horrible job. But there were lots of other things involved in brick making as well. This cycle of material involved the bricks being carried down the river from Kent to London. And I found out earlier on, one barge could carry 40,000 bricks. So about 1 million bricks could arrive in London in a single day. So the proportion of London that was probably built out of barge carried bricks is kind of phenomenal. So on the way back, the barges would carry rubbish from London to be burned either in the brick kilns or to make ash, which was mixed into the bricks. And I watched a documentary a little while ago that said there are modern brick works still burning Victorian rubbish because the barges managed to carry that much of it, which is also amazing. So yeah, so here we get to the Second World War. Many of them were requisitioned, some were requisitioned but were never used, and that was kind of the end of the line to them. Lots of them had engines added, some were used to anchor barrage balloons, some took part in Dunkirk. This is Pudge. She's being rebuilt at the moment, but she's still going. She's a Dunkirk little ship. So honourable mention there. So where does the commercial story end? Well, so far, it ended with this barge. This is Cambria, and she is the last British registered vessel to ever carry a cargo under sail alone. And the thing I think is really, really impressive about that is because it's a lot later than you'd ever really guess. She carried that cargo in 1970. That was how long the barges managed to compete with and exist alongside rail cargo and cargo vessels with engines. It was very much into the second half of the 20th century. So I think Cambria should be a household name, but there we go. Oh, she still doesn't have an engine as well. So yeah, there are, aside from Cambria, there are quite a few barges still going. Many of them are charter vessels. They carry passengers on day trips or longer for a weekend or a week. But I think, as Richard will be talking about later, there are other people with plans to bring back barges carrying cargoes, like the Blue Mermaid, which is pictured in the top right, which I'm really looking forward to seeing more of. But yeah, so I guess that's their story up until now. So that's all well and good, but why does this matter? I've just spent 15 minutes or so talking to you about the history of these boats that carried very prosaic, mundane cargoes around a few counties and into London. you know, I've been to a lot of talks like this, which is just someone talking about something they really love, but why should anyone else care about it? And I think there's a lot of reasons, and I really hope I can convince you of that now. So first and foremost, I think the way that they really challenge our assumptions about technological progression and the idea that cargo carried by sail is a kind of old and outmoded idea, and something it was inefficient, and it was replaced by more efficient modern technology, which was engines and trains. They absolutely question that, because they developed to be in competition with those things and managed to compete with them successfully, as I've said, for nearly a century, or over a century, and well into the second half of the 20th century, which also leads on to the point that I think it's a really, really interesting story to look at, in the sense of how beautifully designed and well engineered they were for what they did, and how successfully they managed to do that in an era where we are facing severe environmental concerns, and we're looking for greener modes of transport, and reducing carbon emissions. Maybe we don't have to look that far. Maybe we don't have to really reinvent the wheel here. Perhaps we just have to reinvent the spritzel rig, if you'd forgive the joke. But lastly, because I'm an archaeologist and my background and my passion really lies in heritage, I would say I think the barges that remain and that are still sailing are an amazing legacy and a fantastic tribute to this fascinating story, which is so much deeper than what I've been able to say here, and I've probably overrun. And I think the fact that there are so many of them still sailing, and that you can step onto a barge, you can still step onto the Cambria and sail her the way she would have been sailed 100 years ago. And there's so many of them left. They're kind of like one of our largest still functioning legacies to our maritime heritage. And I think they've got a really fascinating story. And I think that's kind of a reward in itself. And I think that is something that's really worth celebrating and valuing, because I think people often talk about these things in terms of protecting them and saving them. And that always sounds very sad and alarmist, even though it's true. So yeah, I think they're well worth championing and valuing as well. Yeah, that's it from me. I'm going to leave you on the deck of the Hydrogen here, probably one of the first times I was ever sailing a barge. And I'm going to hand over to Richard Titchener.
Right, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the chance to talk to you, and thank you, Maddie, for that lovely introduction. You'll probably realise we are going to touch on Thames barges, but we'll cover a few other things as well. You can see from that quick introductory slide, I work for a charity called Sea Change. We're really involved in working afloat with young people, vulnerable adults, and as such we've come at cargo from a slightly different direction. We don't really think we'll make any money out of it, but we do think it'll be a fantastic way of having a reason to go from place to place while training young people in traditional seamanship. That's where we work, the Thames Estuary. Many of you will recognise that, although I see there are some people from all over the world watching us tonight, so a great honour to welcome you. But Malden is in the centre of that of the estuary, and very close by to us is a canal that the Inland Waterways Association has a very direct hand in, the Shelmer and Blackwater Canal, a member of the Malden Heritage Harbour Group, which we're also proud to support, and Brian, I hope, will say a bit more about later. Interesting to hear Maddie talk about the Cambria and saying she should be a household name. Well, in this household, actually she is, because we had the honour of being involved with her when she was rebuilt and came back to work in 2011. So a bit more about Cambria and Sea Change later. We're going to talk about cargo under sail, have a little look at the historical context, the slow end to commercial sail, which Maddie did refer to. It took a long time to go, and although it's a long time ago now when you're talking to a young person, I can remember the Cambria loaded in the Whittaker on her way to Rochester. It doesn't seem that long ago to me. Then we went through the wilderness years from 1970 to possibly the early 2000s, although you could probably find somewhere in the world cargo is being carried in under sail. It certainly wasn't happening much around here. And of course, we've had the emergence of a green mission to save the planet, to think about global warming in everything that we do, and that's having a bearing upon cargo under sail, and hopefully will continue to. Recent developments, we'll have a look at what's going on just now and some of the future possibilities. Well, we did once have, just as we do now, an integrated cargo system, but it was a long time before Amazon deliveries. These two photographs of the Regent's Canal dock from slightly different perspectives. On the left, you've got shipping, dun lighters, Thames lighters, and of course a sailing barge. So they were connected to all parts of the globe, but through the narrow boats that you see loaded, I think it says there, with steel. So where they were going, I don't know, but that dock, and hence the globe, was connected to almost all parts of the United Kingdom as well. I don't know quite how long it would take now to get from London to Birmingham. I think if you look on Google, it tells you it would take about 3 or 4 days. I think you can run it in 22 hours, but if you were going up the cut in the last years of commercial carriage, I'd be really interested to know, perhaps under questions at the end, how long people thought it might take. I think I read somewhere they were running day and night, and they were possibly doing it in 2 days and a night, or maybe 2 days and 2 nights. There were survivors from commercial sail, like the Cambria, going on a lot longer than perhaps was expected. Just before the Second World War was what became known as the last grain race, at a time when Gustav Ericsson, a great owner of commercial sail in Finland and the Åland Islands, bought up as many as he could of the then square rig ships that were capable of going around the world, and he brought grain from Australia to Europe. The last grain race of any consequence took place in 1939. One of the vessels that was in that was this, the Pamir. And the Pamir continued after the Second World War, although she was held during the war, unable to work. I think she was in New Zealand at that time, but she continued after the war under German owners, and she was involved then in training officers for the Merchant Marine. She's significant to our story because she was lost in 1957 in a hurricane, loaded with Argentinian wheat, which shifted. She was lost in the Atlantic, and sadly 80 of her 86 crew were lost, and that really was a death knell to sail training with cargo and young people for many years after that. Her sister ship, the Passat, survived shifting cargo and is now commemorated. I think she's in Lübeck in the Baltic in Germany. Norfolk Wherry Trust was formed in 1949 to keep a wherry going, and they did that with cargo for a number of years. The Kathleen and May, a West Country schooner, didn't finish trading until 1967, by then with auxiliary power. And of course, this didn't stop overnight. The docks that the barges, the sailing barges, were servicing with the overside work straight into the ships in the docks, like you see on the right there, they continued in the Royal Docks until 1982. The photograph on the left was taken in 1975 with ammunition going into an Iranian ship anchored at the Chapman anchorage off Canby Island. And the middle of those 3 motor barges that you see alongside there is the Hydrogen, a previously rigged sailing barge, now re-rigged again, having been built to carry coal tar products, I think it was, from the north to Sittingbourne. She's now carrying passengers from Malden, one of the vessels in the Topsail Charters fleet, along with the Thistle that Maddie showed you a photograph of earlier on. So there were the wilderness years where the sailing barges became motor barges, and gradually the picture changed. And then the Cambria was the last of the last. So the last of the sailormen, as one of his books called himself, was Bob Roberts, the guy who's leaning against the wheelbox on the Cambria there. And to his left is Ginger Latham, Philip Latham, who you can see again in the photo on the right with his left arm on the wheel of the Cambria, and on the other side of the wheel is Dick Durham. So Ginger was a mate in about 1962 to 64, and Dick was the last mate in trade on a British registered ship. And the occasion is the Cambria coming back to sail, being blessed, having been rebuilt at Faversham with a lottery grant, and that was taken in 2011. As I said earlier, we were lucky enough to have some time aboard her in those few years, and we took her to places she used to go. So one year we went to Norwich, and there she is on the right, leaving Yarmouth under sail in 2014, just as she had done 50 years forward. Almost an identical photograph from a different perspective. The wind's the same direction. There she is leaving Yarmouth back in the day. And like many barges, she races and does very well in the coasting class. This is in the Thames match in 2011. We recreated her final cargo, which was 1970, October 1970, 100 tons of cattle cake from Tilbury Dock to Ipswich Dock. And here you see Dick Durham, who came with us, looking at one of our trainees, Dean. T is what most Thames barges run on. The big pile of scrap in the background is on its way to China. We found some cement to take to Ipswich, and 24 hours later, there we were discharging a pallet load of cement for a couple of charities in Ipswich Dock. We took some beer around the coast for the Mighty Oak Brewery in Malden, and there it is going onto a horse and cart in Brightlingsea on the Hard. Now we're coming up to date a bit more now. This is a very famous boat, and this is the Tres Hombres. 3 men, and there's the 3 men on the right. The middle of the 3 men is John Langlin, who you'll see feature a bit later, both in this presentation and in what Brian's going to tell us later. The Tres Hombres travels between the Caribbean and Europe with high-value products like chocolate, coffee and rum. She's engineless. Those 3 guys in 2007, when they were sailing together on the bark Europa, thought really we should do something about saving this environment, and they set out to do it, and they've done it. They're doing very, very well, and they set in train a number of other groups, companies, vessels that have followed in their wake. The Gallant's another one. She's currently in Martinique, and she'll be coming back to the UK loaded with coffee. Back in September, she delivered coffee to various ports along the south and east coast of England, one of which was Queenborough, and she put some coffee in the Dawn, sailing barge Dawn, which we know well in Brightlingsea. And she took that coffee, although she's not loaded with it in these photographs. These photographs are what she did some years before with Griff Rhys-Jones. You might have seen her on TV carrying a haystack up the Thames, recreating what the stack barges used to do, because the Dawn was indeed built as a stack barge at Malden in 1895, and she's been returned to tiller steering, which is unique amongst our fleet. She carried coffee from the Gallant at Queenborough, through the bridge and up to Milton and to Sittingbourne, and then round to Faversham. and that was done for an organisation called New Dawn Traders. You can read a bit about it here. It's a fantastic organisation which is based down in Falmouth, run by a lady called Alex, who really has started to make things happen. It might be small amounts. The Thames Barges, for example, carries about 30 tonnes of cargo. The Gallant, I think, a good bit more. But they've got 26 sail cargo projects on the go, and they're also building the market, which is so important to selling the produce that will come on your sailing vessel with the extra kudos that entails. Over in Costa Rica, they're actually building a 250-tonne capacity wooden sailing vessel, which will have electric power, called the Seba. It's happening. The Kwai out in the Pacific trades between Hawaii and other islands. The Vega runs between Europe and Indonesia, the Far East, and I'm sure goes other places as well, usually with medical supplies, cleaning the oceans of plastic, and she works occasionally with New Dawn Traders too. Now, what do you make of this? Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Well, it's a little bit of both, really, isn't it? It's got 5 plane wings stuck on the top, which look as though they reef. You can drop them down and adjust for the wind. And it's a design concept that Wallenius in Sweden, who transport cars, have come up with to transport cars across the Atlantic. It's a fantastic idea, and there's every chance that something like it's going to happen. I just wonder, post-COVID, whether we've learned whether we should be transporting cars across the ocean 7,000 at a time, or whether we didn't ought to be looking at more indigenous manufacture. But our memories might be short on that one. I think something close to that's going to happen. And it's far more likely, I think, to happen, given the amount of money behind that kind of international transport, than that we see ships like the Pamir going around Cape Horn carrying our freight in the future. I think we're going to see modern ideas using the best of the old and the best of the new. Like the Maltese Falcon. Okay, it's a super yacht, but it has a small crew. It has fabric sails that kind of roll away, all push button, designed by a guy called Dijkstra in Holland, and he's also involved in modern sailing ship design for large container ships, and I think that's possibly going to really turn into something. Watching her sailing as close to the wind as a modern 4.5 rig yacht really gives Square Rig a completely new set of opportunities. I said we'd hear again about John Langlin of the Thames Barges. He is now running the Eco Clipper projects in Altmark in Holland, and they're well advanced with plans and with fundraising to build a replica of what they say is the fastest Dutch clipper ship. It wasn't the Cutty Sark, it was Dutch. Maybe we'll see a Cutty Sark replica one day that'll beat her, but she's going to happen, I'm convinced of it, and she's going to work around the globe, hopefully bringing on board other people to build other similar ships afterwards. She'll be engineless because John really is a fundamentalist, like many of us, believing that it's different if you can press a button. Your relationship with the vessel and your relationship with the environment, harmonizing with tide, wind and water, is different. So to recap, lots of different ways of going about the same thing, I guess. There's high value cargo with small payloads. It often includes passengers who can pay to enjoy the pleasure, just as we might take trainees sailing. Some have engines, some don't. There are some new builds, not many of them yet, but there's a couple that we know about that are well advanced with higher capacities, and it's going to happen. Then there's what Brian's going to talk about in a little while, adding sail to motor ships, and I think that's looking near too. That's actually starting to come good, and it's resulting in a reduction in costs for those shipping lines. Then, of course, there's what we're talking about. Well, we work afloat with young people. If we can carry cargo as well, then we're turning our educational charity into something that hopefully helps the environment as well. So that's what we do. We've been doing it since 2007 with hired vessels like the Cambria, the Wivenhoe, beforehand, the Reminder, that you saw in one of our photographs earlier on. We sail with about 200 people a year. We're members of ASTO. Well, ASTO, the Association of Sail Training Organisations, between us, we sail with 10,000 young people a year. So that starts to be a meaningful number. And we have clients from age 8 to people living with dementia. And we do it by living and working together aboard residentially, which is why we're listening so avidly to what the Prime Minister is saying at the moment about when we can restart our activity. It isn't anytime soon, but hopefully by May, by the look of things. And we take groups accompanied by their support staff and sometimes individuals for seamanship training and experience. And I should add that we're very happy when we have a slot in the itinerary, and this year we do because of COVID and the effect it's had upon us. We're very happy to take people who'd like to come and learn about sailing a barge, maybe come on a barge match with us. So if you're interested in that, please do get in touch with Libby. This is what we do, traditional seamanship training, swinging the lead. Not many yachtsmen do that these days. You have to do that with us if you're coming as a young person. We teach them to row, have dinghies for sailing. This is one of the most wonderful things about a Thames barge. If you count on here how many people you can engage, I know you can do it with 2, but look, we've got 9 people here and a scoutmaster at the back holding the binoculars up in a manly pose, getting the mainsail off on the reminder. And a few minutes later, you can be on the beach, climbing down a ladder, and that's what you do on the beach with the barge in the background. But if you want to clean the barnies off the bottom, that's similarly what you got to do. That's a thin mill on the blocks. Well, we've built a new sailing barge that's a replica of the original Blue Mermaid, and here's a photograph of the original loaded before the Second World War. Sadly, she was lost with her crew in 1942, but she was one of the last 2 built. And here is the new Blue Mermaid, welded rather than riveted, built by Tom's at Polruan and launched in May 2016. Since when? She's been fitted out at Malden, sailing in 2019 for the first time. So that was a picture of Ollie's knee, together with a bit of the barge in the background. I should say Ollie's pulled some of these photos together for me, so thanks very much, Ollie. So we don't think we'll make any money from carrying cargo. If we do, it'll be an added bonus, but these are the 1930s, 1961, 1925 freight rates, and we're going to offer you the chance to put 100 tons in the Blue Mermaid, take it from London to Yarmouth, and we'll charge you 19 and 6 a tonne. But we'd rather like you to support the charitable work that we do if you felt so inclined at the same time. The future. Well, we offset our carbon, and many people do, but I think that there might be some interesting things coming with carbon trading in the future, and we may find that we can actually help shipping companies by carrying under sail to offset their carbon. They find it a bit more difficult to offset it than we do. True carbon cost comparison. It's not a very level playing field at the moment. Even if you do replace lorries with electric lorries going up and down the A12, the A12 is built by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the 8-lane motorway along the coast doesn't have any such support. So I think there's work that can be done to do that. And of course, what we're all looking at is developing a cargo network that has started with the work that Alex is doing with New Dawn Traders. And I think we're all going to be picking up on that and following her lead. But lastly, I think there's some really fascinating developments in the way that the governments around the world are starting to think about the climate emergency, as it's being called. They're now telling us that we're going to do things without even knowing quite how we're going to do them. So we're going to be replacing coking coal with something else within the next 15 years, because we're not allowing deep mining anymore to get that coking coal. So that means it's going to have to be funded, and that could be very exciting for cargo under sail. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm going to pass over now to Brian, who's going to tell us a bit about some more modern developments, more than I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Now, unfortunately, a couple of days ago, my technology failed me, so Derek is going to show the slides for me. Thank you, Derek. Right, so I'm Brian Corbett. I'm same as Maddie. I'm a trustee of the Maritime Heritage Trust. I also represent the OGA, or the Gaffers Association of the UK, on the European Maritime Heritage. And I have to say, in spite of Brexit, we have very, very strong maritime heritage links with virtually every country in Europe, and long may it remain. Maritime heritage predated the EEC, and it's going to be around long after the EU and the Euros have been forgotten about. Richard made reference to John Langerman and Langlin, and the fact that he was the skipper of the Tres Ombre for quite a few years. Now, he's developing with the Eco Clipper one of three major developments as far as wind-assisted ship propulsion is concerned. The European Union are funding a very major developments looking at wind-assisted ship propulsion, which everybody calls WASP, of course, now. WASP exists, you know, the people involved, ship owners, technology providers, universities, many shipping companies. And the interesting thing, as I say, is really into three aspects. One aspect that Jorn is developing with Eco Clippers. If we can have a look at the next slide, Derek, please. Yeah, so the first part of it is really developing what effectively is a modern replica of the Clippers. I mean, the Clippers, the likes of Cutty Sark and Thermopylae, they developed after a couple of thousand years development to eventually get the fastest vessels under sail. And of course, they largely had to give way to steam. And probably, although there were some great races, especially between Aries and Thermopylae, and Richard mentioned the tea trade, and in fact some of the very long trips from Australia. Could we, Derek, can we go on to the next slide? Slides aren't changing, Derek.
Sorry, Brian, I might have to come out again. Okay.
Okay, not at all. Yes, one of the things, why Derek's doing that, one of the things that I've been involved with in the last couple of years is setting up heritage harbours around the coast of the UK. We've got 6 or 7 heritage harbours at the moment, and a lot of you from the inland waterways will know that in conjunction with Amy Tilson, and members of a lot of the branches, the IWA branches, we've recently started to establish what we're calling heritage ports on the canals and river system. And I'm really pleased to say that after an inaugural meeting at Chester, at the Chester branch last week, we are now looking at very, very quickly, Chester will be set up as the first heritage port on the canal system. And it won't be very long before Stourport, Brentford, possibly Warwick Bar in Birmingham, many others will continue. That's a photograph come up on the screen now is of Jorn Langlin. And as I say, his particular part of developing wind-assisted ship propulsion is more than wind-assisted, because he's talking about building a modern version of a clipper. If we can go on to the next slide, Derek, please. And the next one. And the next. That's what she looks like. And a lot of you will see quite a strong resemblance between that vessel and the Cutty Sark. So there's quite a lot of similarities. But the main thing is, as Richard mentioned, Jorn intends her to be engineless. And the interesting thing, there are outer gallants. You can see it particularly on the forward mast. You can see the sails, which are the outer gallants, and they in fact will make her very much more efficient than the previous clippers. Next slide, Derek, please. Now, the other aspect, of course, as I say, the first part is complete sail, which is Jorn is looking at. The next one is looking at, and this is the same vessel, the Ocean Bird from Wallenius Marine that Richard made reference to. Now, their idea and this design is effectively 90% of the propulsion will be from those sails, leaving only 10% from auxiliary engines. And that is very, very significant. I mean, one of the main reasons for the European Union wanting to start the WASP project is because there is a major need to decarbonize shipping. A lot of you will know that one of the worst places in Great Britain now for contaminated air is at Southampton on a Sunday, when there's a tremendous number of Saturday night right through to Sunday evening, when most of the cruise ships, there can be as many as 8 or 9 cruise ships changing over passengers, etc. And because they won't use shore power, because it's so expensive, they run their massive, great big generators, their big diesel generators. And all of the seafront at Southampton on a Sunday gets really, really nasty. So decarbonisation of shipping is considered to be one of the greatest maritime challenges. So as I say, the Ocean Bird, effectively ships like that will be 90% sail and only 10% power. Next slide, Derek, please. Now that's an interesting one. This is rather than just trade in goods, this is the latest of the Star Clippers fleet. She's 162 meters long, 18.5 meters wide. She has 5 decks, will accommodate 450 passengers with, 450 people. That's 300 passengers in 150 luxury cabins and 150 members of the crew in 74 staff cabins. If you saw the recent documentary on super yachts, the skipper of one of those yachts will have shown you how tiny the actual staff cabins are. But at Star Clippers, there are a couple of smaller companies as well. There is a company that has a vessel which is about 120 years old, and she comes across the Atlantic with cruise passengers and also goes up to Spitsbergen as well, above the Arctic Circle. Next slide, Derek, please. Now that's again is the Gallant. Next slide. Richard made reference to the Gallant. I had the great pleasure of being able to order I have a particular penchant for Portuguese wine, which is very underrated, I think. Olive oil, olives, chocolate from Colombia. It was, as Richard mentioned, the De Gallant loaded on, I think in August, she loaded part of her cargo onto the Thames Sailing Barge Dawn. The Dawn then came into Milton Creek. So next slide, Derek, please. And that's Milton Creek. She went on from Milton into Faversham Creek, and that was where I met up with the crew and purchased my my goods. She then went on to Whitstable and moored in. But the interesting thing about Milton Creek, very, very sadly, Milton Creek goes right up into the centre of Sittingbourne. Sittingbourne's never really been known as a port as such, and sadly won't in the future, because developers, there are massive, great big industrial trade estates all around Sittingbourne in Kent, and the county council, together with the developers, sadly decided that they needed a very low modern bridge. And when the Dawn came up into Milton Creek, she had to stop down the creek from the bridge, the new bridge. And two of the young ladies in the on the Dawn, they offloaded the cargo that was coming up into what you're looking at is Lloyd's Wharf at Sittingbourne, and they sailed the cargo in their barge boat, and they just had enough space to get under the bridge, and that was really good. But one of the reasons I'm showing this picture of Lloyd's Wharf, right, one of those buildings right in the middle is going to be the new Dolphin Thames Sailing Barge Museum. There was a previous Dolphin museum, which very, very strangely caught fire just before the arrangements were made for building the bridge, which was all a bit of a mystery, really, one way and another. Anyway, there's a beautiful new building. That's a beautiful new building now for the Dolphin Museum. And of course, the big advantage is it literally is only 5 minutes walk from Sittingbourne railway station. It's not geared up yet. The building's been finished, but the guy who runs it, Nigel, he will be. He's got quite a lot of the accoutrements and the Thames barges, all of the equipment, etc., from the previous museum, and I'm sure he'll come by a lot of information. But similar sort of pattern to what Richard does with Sea Change. There is a barge called the Raybell, which is situated there outside the new museum building. She's currently been rebuilt by Tim Goldsack, expert in refurbishing and rebuilding Thames Sailing barges, and they are the Raybell project. They're very much involved with the De Gallant as well, and their crews. Now, because as I say, it's unlikely that Sittingbourne, because of the lack of access, because of the low bridge, Sittingbourne can't really become a heritage harbour on its own. So what we've done, we've linked Sittingbourne with Queenborough. So it's one of the new heritage harbours will be Queenborough and Milton Creek. So that's good. Next slide, Derek, please. Now this is interesting to say that there's not that many places in the world where fishing is still carried out solely under sail. I have to say, my late wife and I spent a bit of time. We had a few holidays in Sri Lanka, and they have their catamarans are a little bit like proa Caribbean catamarans, but they still fish under sail. But interestingly, the Falmouth workboats, and this is the one you're looking at, is the Alf Smithers. She was built in the early 60s. I think she was the last of the wooden Falmouth workboats, and they actually dredge. You're not allowed in Garrett Roads. You are not allowed to dredge for oysters under power. So there's a goodly fleet of those beautiful Falmouth workboats who still dredge for oysters under sail, And the young chap, Ranger, a good friend of mine, he rebuilt Al Smithers and uses it. He fishes, he dredges for oysters. And if you can just go on to the next slide, Derek, please. Now that's interesting. Those two boats are not that very much difference in length. That's me and my little classic boat, the Winifred. And Ranger and I, over a period of about four years, we had a tremendous rivalry, because although those working boats are much heavier, you're looking at about 1.5 to 2 ton of boats, whereas my little boat there, the Winifred, she weighs less than half a ton. And of course, because I was in the same class as the working boats, we were having great rivalry. If it was blowing a hoolie, if it was blowing hard, then the working boats would be well away, leave me behind in the doldrums. But if it was light winds, I would leave them in my wake. And over 4 years, Ranger and I sort of shared the 1 year he would win the trophy, the next year I would win, and carried on for about, as I say, about 4 years. And the trophy was a great big rigging block with all of the appropriate bits of shoals, etc., that had cemented themselves onto this. I think it was from a 16th century shipwreck. And of course, you're not allowed to remove anything from shipwrecks, but the yacht club that ran the Falmouth Classics, obviously, they'd come by that. And in fact, it was so heavy, there was no way if you won it, you could ever send it back by post. So, you were duty bound to come back to the regatta. So it was a very good market employ. Now, I mentioned, obviously, Jorn's approach to building a clipper. There is, in fact, and Richard mentioned Cutty Sark. There is a project, Cutty Sark to Sail, and a good Russian friend of ours in the European Maritime Heritage, Vladimir Martis. Vladimir, in actual fact, built a replica of a 16th century Russian frigate called the Standard, and some of you may have seen her at the Southampton Boat Show the year before last. And Vladimir is determined he is going to build a replica of the Cutty Sark, hence Cutty Sark to Sail. Is that, Derek? I think that's the last. Slide, isn't it? I think. Now, interestingly, we've put on the chat a reference to a short video film, a 5-minute video film, which deals with the other modern aspects of wind-assisted ship propulsion, and that is fitting solid sails to modern motor vessels. And it's amazing. The irony is, one of the Swedish shipping companies, has recently sold an oil tanker which is fitted with auxiliary sails. And there's a certain irony about that. Auxiliary sails on an oil tanker. I think that's quite good. And you'll be able to pick up, and one of the main advantages you'll see from the video, the sails don't only give propulsion, they actually do an awful lot to stop ships rolling. I was in my much younger days, I was a seagoing engineer with the Royal Fleet Auxiliary on tankers. And of course, we used to do what we call RAS, which was refueling at sea. We had the great pleasure of refueling the Royal Yacht at sea. But I mean, one of the interesting things, when you're doing RAS, you're connected by an umbilical cord, a big pipeline, flexible pipeline carrying the oil. And one of the problems is you've got to do it at speed, because you can only keep control of a vessel with adequate speed to be able to maintain control on the rudder. And both ships obviously have got to be doing the same speed. You could control that as long as you were doing an adequate amount of steering way. But what you couldn't control was the amount of yawing and the amount of rolling that the ships were doing. And of course, if on your tanker, you were rolling at the opposite way to the frigate or the destroyer, it could get quite hairy. But that was the only time we engineers were allowed up onto deck to help the deck officers to carry out RAS. But the interesting thing, and if any of you look at that 5-minute video, you'll see that what the sails are doing is also helping cut out the amount of roll as well. So it's quite significant. Those auxiliary sails can actually make the passage of a ship much more comfortable for the crew. And of course, the other aspect of it, you cut the rolling, you actually improve the fuel consumption as well. Right, now the last thing I want to mention, quite a lot of you will be involved in the local branches, the local London branches of the IWA. And some of you might know, a fortnight ago, we had the inaugural meeting of the London River Heritage Harbour Group. And we've, as far as I'm concerned, London very sadly has been tearing its back on maritime floating maritime heritage. And we've got to reverse that. We've got to make sure that we have got safe havens on the London River, not only for Thames Sailing Barges, but for some of the historic tugs. We've got the Maltese Shore, very historic, very interesting fire tender, etc. And if any of you are interested in being a member of the London River Heritage Harbour Group, I would really welcome inviting some, not just narrowboat owners, but everybody with a real strong interest for the London River Group. That would be great. Libby, I think that's all I've got. So we're over to questions and answers, I think.
Thank you, all of you, for a really interesting presentation. There have been a few questions that have come through, and I'm going to invite, we haven't got a great deal of time, but I will, if anyone thinks of anything else, please put it in the Q&A as soon as you can. But I'm going to start with a couple of questions that came through there from somebody during Maddie's talk, and I presume that it referred to Maddie's comment about the number of crew, because the person has said, how does that compare with Dutch sailing barges with only 2 crew? And then a few minutes later added, or indeed sailing barges elsewhere in the UK.
Yeah, I suppose I'm not sure what exactly you mean by compare, in what way. I suppose I didn't want to imply that kind of Thames barges were like the most amazing boats in the world, and there were no other vessels at that time that were doing equally impressive work. And so there are lots of other boats that were just as well I guess designed and adapted for the work that they did. But yeah, because this was a 15-minute talk, it's a lot easier to, for what I wanted to follow kind of one case study of one particular type of vessel that was very well adapted
I think
the work that it did.
I think maybe the reference was to the crew, but the person's come back again. Sorry, it's anonymous, so I don't know who it is. Saying, referring to the choice of rig, that is.
It is, yes. I mean, it is true that very, very, very generally, the crew were 2. In fact, they always used to say a skipper, a mate and a dog. And the Thames Sailing Barges had some wonderful dogs, as 1 or 2 of them still do. I sail on the Morosa, and, Peter's dog's always on board. But no, it is very comparable, Libby, that most sailing barges sailed with a crew of 2, just a master, a skipper and a mate. And of course, as Maddie said, the rig was designed so that, you had to be pretty powerful and strong, but it was manageable with 2. The interesting thing was, on one of Maddie's photographs of the old craft, you could see the rig was lowered, and Thames Sailing Barges have always been able to shoot the bridges. And of course, up on the London River, they used to go up the Thames and shoot the low bridges. And of course, they used to have what they call hufflers, because you needed a bit of assistance. And hufflers would row out and climb on board the barge and would help the skipper and the mate while they were just negotiating the bridge. But yeah, definitely comparable to the Dutch barges.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Maddie. We have questions that came through during Richard's talk, so I shall put these to Richard. When you mentioned the Vega cleaning seas, did you mean that it's literally cleaning parts of the ocean using some sort of net or capture system?
I think it's probably that they clean up the beaches in the Pacific, and as you know, some of those beaches are absolutely covered in plastic waste. It has to be said, none of that's coming from this country or even North Europe. It's the Far East, but it's a big problem in the Pacific. A friend of mine was crossing the Pacific in an owner's yacht not many years ago. They stopped on the windward side of the island, went ashore, thought, what's all the fuss about? Walked round to the other side, and the wind had changed. And the previous week, that beach had been completely covered, and I mean knee deep in plastic waste. So the Vega's just doing their bit, I think. I don't know exactly how they do it, I'll be honest with you.
Thank you. And the same person's asked, does the Sea Change Sailing Trust have any transatlantic partners? And how does the trust view the idea of skills preservation?
Yeah, two questions. Well, we don't have any transatlantic partners. Doesn't mean we wouldn't be interested in meeting some, given that we've got participants from all over the world here this evening. So let me know if that's you, Quetzal. But the question about skills preservation, we're very keen on that, if for no other reason. I'm 65 and I'm a young barge skipper. So there aren't that many of us around now, and we've got a fairly high age profile. We're engaged in a partnership with National Historic Ships where there are 8 partners, part museum, part operational, who have been taking trainees through 1-year programs supported by the Future Skills funding stream of the Heritage Lottery Fund. And that's shortly coming to an end. So we're very keen on that, and we're going to continue that legacy. We also do work at the moment funded by Trinity House to help train future skippers and crews of the surviving fleet, which is a fleet of some 30 odd vessels, so it's significant.
Right. Whilst you were talking then, somebody sent through on the chat a message saying Vega has a Facebook page that this person follows. Sadly, she's had some problems, but do follow it for updates. And
That's really useful.
it also says, and perhaps warnings about various shipyards.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
So that's come through from somebody.
Libby, there is a similar there's a similar project based at Exmouth, and they have actually got capturing equipment. So they actually, sail way down the channel into the Atlantic and actually are capturing plastic. And that's they're taking they in fact allow youngsters to go on as well. If they Google Exmouth ocean plastics, people will find that.
Right, thank you. Another comment from the same questioner again. Do you know if the Blue Mermaid was welded rather than riveted as a cost-saving measure, or was there another reason?
That's a really interesting question, because we would have loved to have built a riveted replica, and we did indeed look at that. At the time we were starting out on our fundraising project, there was work being done to build a new Medway Queen down at Bristol, and we did go down and have a look at that job and liked it very much. But we came to the conclusion that firstly, we're not really a preservation organisation, we're about operating and sail training, so we couldn't really justify what we thought was going to be at least double the cost if we'd gone for riveted. But it's a very good question, and I think there's a message there somewhere for the maintenance of traditional riveted vessels. It's usually, in this country, we usually just cut out the affected bit and weld a new bit in. Whereas I think you'll probably find in Germany, possibly in Holland, they tend to rivet a new bid in, and I think there's a message there for our approach to maintenance.
Right. Somebody's come back on the chat saying, I must take issue with Richard Kitchener's assertion the rubbish in the Pacific does not come from Europe. A great deal of it does.
Yeah, I guess he's probably talking about the fact that for some years at least, we've been sending our rubbish to China for recycling. I don't know if that's what he's getting at. May well be. The Chinese have stopped us doing that. But
added Britain's largest containerized export is household rubbish exposed by the local council. Can I just ask if anyone's got comments to make that that rather than putting them in the chat, that they it just so happens I've managed to pick up those two, but it's I'm monitoring the Q&A box, and so please could you put comments that relate to questions into the Q&A, even if it's not a question, because that'll be easier not to miss anything. Right, we have another question saying, in their heyday, approximately how many Thames barges would have been operating in the estuary? Now, I don't know whether that's in the which particular estuary Colin's referring to, but maybe you can answer in such a way that covers Thames, covers Malden, covers Strood and who.
It would have been the Thames Estuary. And from what I've read, the numbers vary kind of wildly, but it was in the thousands. I think the one that a lot of people settle on is about 6,000 barges. Give or take, might have been a bit more or less, but yeah, around that many, unless you want to chip in, Richard.
Well, you just got to bear in mind, of course, that they were being built over a period of 150, 200 years in a recognisable form. So in that period, of course, many would fall by the wayside just as new ones were being built. But there's a fairly commonly accepted view that around about 1900, which is taken to be the heyday, there was something like 3,000, maybe a bit more, actually in operation based in and around the Thames Estuary, which is a fantastic number, isn't it?
Yeah. Right. Actually, there aren't any more questions. Oh, wait a minute. There's maybe one more just come through. Somebody else has asked. Oh, here's the one. Yes, the book. Catherine has said the book, "The Last Grain Race" by Eric Newby, is to be recommended. He sailed on the Moshulu. It is a fascinating, very entertaining, even if you're not interested in sailing. So thank you, Catherine, for that. That's a useful thing to know. And
Libby,
yes,
Libby, can I just mention something that I meant to mention earlier on? Last week, I was invited to attend a webinar of the Royal Institute of Naval Architects, and there were 150 naval architects from all over the world. And would you believe they were discussing the very technical nature of all of the various assisted ship propulsion, sail and solid sail, various types of wind vanes. So they really are taking it very seriously. You've got many of the very leading naval architects from everywhere, Japan, China. They really were very well represented.
thank you. Thank you very much. Catherine has added that he has interesting things to say about the speed and economics of cargo under sail. Oops, it's just moved, so I can't see it.
What we've got to do is stop everybody thinking they must have what they want from Amazon tomorrow. Because 99% of what they want, they don't need tomorrow. They'd be quite happy having it in 2 or 3 weeks' time. You know?
Absolutely. Yes, she says a sailing ship needs a much larger crew and may be slower depending on winds. He also commented that a sailing ship with an auxiliary engine never made as good passage as the one without. Thank you, Catherine, for that. And I think we may have one more question that's come through. I know it's well, I think we're there. And as one more, one more comment probably applies to both types of Amazon. I like that. I think that's a very good note to finish on. And I know we've overrun quite a bit, but I think it's with three of you to present. You've had a lot of material to give us, and I'd like to thank you all so much for giving up your time this evening to speak to us and share your knowledge and your enthusiasm, which has been really great. And there's been quite a few comments that have come back saying how much people have enjoyed it. So if anybody wants to take up Brian's suggestion that they might want to get involved in the maritime, with the harbours project, you've all got my email because the reminder came back out in my name. So you've all got my email address. So if you're interested or want to follow up with any other questions, please do so. And that brings us to the end of this evening. And again, a very big thank you to Maddie and to Richard and to Brian for all they have done this evening. And just to remind you that because February is is 28 days, we'll end up with our next one being on March the 22nd as well. And that's going to be a talk from Richard Thomas about the gunpowder mills on the River Lee, which I strongly recommend you to come to. And you should have had that on your circulation, because when I sent out the general information, it has the next few talks. So do sign up for that if you would like to come. And I wish you a good night and good luck with Boris's exit from lockdown. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Libby. Good night.